I'm hoping that his presentation has warmed you up to a political debate, because it's Glasgow, it's day 2, and it's question time. Welcome to everybody, and welcome in particular to our truly talented and slightly large panel today. On our far left, I think you probably recognise her, Helen Stokes-Lampard, Chair of the College and a GP in Lichfield. Next to Helen is Owen Jones, journalist, author and political activist. Next to Owen is Vish Ratnasuriya, who's Chair of Our Health Partnership, an at-scale group in Birmingham, and he's a GP in Harborne. Next to Vish is Carey Lunan, who's chair of RCGP Scotland. She's a GP in a deep end practice in Craigmillar, and you might have recognised from the first session she has a rather fine voice. Next to Carey is Laura Serrant. Laura is Professor of Nursing at Sheffield Hallam University, and until recently she was seconded to the CNO's Chief Nursing Officers Directorate in NHS England. And then next to Laura, finally, we have Stephen Dorrell, who was an MP in Leicestershire for 36 years before retiring in 2015. He's ex-Secretary of State for Health in John Major's government in the late 1990s, past chair of the Commons Health Select Committee, and he's now chair of the NHS Confederation. So please welcome the panel. Now, you'll all know how question time works. Camilla yesterday asked for a few questions from the audience. We've received some. So those questioners will come to the microphone, they'll ask their questions, and then I'll ask selected members of this panel. We won't get all of the panel to answer each question, to respond, and we're hoping for a little bit of lively interaction between the panel members, which I'm going to vainly try to manage, I'm sure, inadequately. There will be time for some extra questions beyond the prepared ones, so please think about questions you might like to ask, but don't come to the microphone until I invite you to do so, otherwise we might end up with long queues. And please do use Twitter. Hashtag down there. It would be great to hear what you're thinking of the discussion, what your responses are to the panel's responses, and I might read out some of the more interesting tweets. Oh, I've had my first tweet already, and it says, "Get on with it," in brackets, please. So, good manner, no trolling, which I'm pleased to see. So let's get going with the first question, and it's Roger Jones on microphone 1.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. I'm Roger Jones. I'm the editor of the British Journal of General Practice, and I'd like to start by asking the panel if they believe that the NHS, as we know it, is going to be affordable in the future.
Owen.
This is one of the wealthiest societies in the history of humanity. If we cannot afford our most valued institution on which the well-being of every individual and an entire society depends on, we might as well give up. Now, we've seen what the NHS has gone through, the longest squeeze in its funding as a proportion of the economy since it was founded back in 1948, where as costs surge, as the population grows, as we have an ever-growing ageing population with growing multi-morbidity, where there'll be 1 million more people in the next few years who have more than 2 chronic illnesses, where we've seen the billions of pounds of cuts to social care, and you know the consequences, the bedrock, as our Secretary of State has described you, although I wish the policies would match the words, where the share of the budget, the share of the NHS going to GPs has fallen, where the number of GPs is falling right now, and the consequences that you face every day, the escalating workload, the fact that 2 out of 5 of GPs suffer mental distress related to their work and are considering leaving the practice, where people's lives are being put as a consequence at risk, where life expectancy growth is stagnating for the fastest rate since the 1890s, where 4 million are on waiting lists. We could go on. But think about how wealthy this nation is. Yeah, we went through one of the worst economic crises in our history. But the wealth of the richest 1,000 people more than doubled in this country over the last few years. Those at the top who are doing very well at the moment aren't often being taxed in the way they should. And we can ask people at the top. They won't be out on the streets. They won't be staring at the ceilings, worrying about paying energy bills like many of your patients do. If we ask them to pay a bit more money so that we can provide an NHS which should be the envy of the entire world, that can provide for an ageing population, that I think is something which is not a sacrifice, but something that can ensure our NHS is stronger than ever. But it's a matter of political will, and it does not exist in this government, which I'm afraid speaks highly of the NHS, but words aren't what matter, it's deeds. And the deeds are they running this NHS down into the ground.
So how many of you in the audience would be happy to pay higher tax to sustain the NHS? And how many of you would still do that in the quiet of the polling booth? Okay, all right, great. Laura?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think that there's another question that comes to mind. Are we really asking whether the NHS is affordable, or are we asking whether it's sustainable? Because I think they're slightly different things. And, you know, I agree with Owen in terms of the financial cost, but I think the human costs that we're facing at the moment also should be right at the forefront of our minds. You know, I out myself, as I've been outed already, as not being a doctor or a GP, but certainly from a nursing point of view and from a wider health point of view, within my profession, we are 42,000 nurses short, and that includes those working in primary care and across the NHS system. And so the costs of whether we can sustain the NHS is equally something that we should be fighting for, both in terms of human cost for the workforce as well as human cost for the patients and the communities.
Thank you very much. Stephen?
I guess if you look at a platform that includes a former Tory MP and Owen Jones, it's one of the less well-kept secrets that we'll disagree at least on nuance. But having said that, actually, between my position and Owen's position, and I'm not going to talk about tax policy, I'm going to talk about health policy, I actually think there isn't a huge amount of difference. And we were asked in the question, is it sustainable and in its present form? First of all, it is sustainable, it is affordable. I'm wholly opposed, as has always been the Tory party's policy, to any move to try to question the basis of the National Health Service as a universal healthcare system paid for out of taxation. That, I think, is right, and when you compare it with other healthcare systems in the world, it delivers good quality care at a more affordable rate than other comparable systems. So I'm not in favour of changing the funding basis. I am, however, in favour of two further things. The first is to ensure that we do ask ourselves the difficult questions about what level of funding is necessary to sustain that fundamental model. That's why at the NHS Confederation, which I chair, we commissioned a report earlier this year from the IFS and from the Health Foundation to look at what is required to deliver the health service over the next 15 years. The answer was very simple: 4% real terms growth for the NHS, and critically 4% for social care, because you can't look at health and social care as two different systems. They have to be the same system. So far, what the government has announced is a very welcome spending increase, but when you take away the statistical games, it's 3% for the NHS and the question mark for social care. So 4 plus 4 is the requirement, 3 plus a question mark is where we've got to. That's the first point. The second point is in the tail end of the question. In its current form, I think that if we're to deliver our health outcome objectives, we need to look at the health service as part of the range of public services that serve the community. Critically, that includes social care, but it looks beyond social care to other forms of public service, for example, social housing. We all talk about Michael Marmot and the social determinants of health. If what we want is healthy outcomes for the reflecting the changing demands of our citizens, then our policy should reflect that. And that's a challenge for everyone who's interested in the future, both of the health service and of the health of our population.
Thank you. Vish.
Without repeating some of the comments that have been made so far, I think, for me, the NHS we describe as a single entity, and I believe it is not in its current form. We have an internal market, and I believe the internal market is what's causing a lot of our problems. In England, we're heading towards a crux point. And what we need to do is really knit together the system that we fragmented over the last couple of decades. And to me, that's one of the biggest determinants of our affordability and sustainability.
Thank you. Carey?
Thank you. And I think for me, there's two aspects to this. I think the simple answer to the question is no, it's not affordable in its current format. And I think there are two things that we need to be considering. One is that there's a lot of rhetoric about moving care out from the acute sector into the community-based sector, and I mean health and social care, but that's not really happened. The resource has not followed the work that has been transferred out from hospitals into the community. And so that means that we can't realistically tackle the persisting health inequalities that we see not just in Scotland but throughout the rest of the UK. And we need to protect the founding principles of the NHS, which is healthcare based on need and not on demand. And that's what brings me on to my second point, which is if we don't address the public expectations of what our NHS can be expected to provide 70 years after its inception, then we may as well stop now and stop devising new models of care, because we can keep building bigger multi-storey car parks and more people will park there. What we need is a national engagement campaign about what is sustainable and what is reasonable for our state-funded NHS to be providing in 2018. This needs to be cross-party and it needs to be led by the healthcare professionals who work on the front line. And without that conversation, I think the NHS in its current format is doomed.
So Roger, what do you think?
I wasn't expecting that, but I kind of agree with almost everything everybody said, but only partly. And I absolutely echo Owen's passion, but also I get the realism. But I do think that we are being made promises to that there's not much sign of being kept. And I think our job at the moment is to make sure that this extra funding really goes to where it's needed. But I'm also somewhat with Carey in being concerned about the social contract, the rising expectations, and the lack of a frank debate about what we can and should provide to the population.
Thank you very much. So I don't want to introduce any competitors amongst the panel, but apparently Owen is getting a lot of support on Twitter. There you go. Let's move on to our second question. Rachel Marchant, who I think is on microphone 3.
Hello, I'm Rachel Marchant. I'm a portfolio GP in Essex. And my question is, what are the risks to general practice of integrated provider contracts? Is there anything we can do to reduce these risks? And do you think it's a good idea for general practice to be run by hospitals?
Helen.
Hello, Rachel, and thank you, Martin. Yes, there are absolutely inherent risks of integrated care. However, there are also incredible opportunities. So much of it is how you deliver it. And I mean, the devil, as always, is in the detail. So, I mean, I really believe in integrated care. I have a profound problem with the way and the structures we have in our NHS at the moment. You know, to me, if you ask a patient what's primary, secondary or social care, they look slightly blank. They just know they need care wrapped around them. And if we were designing an NHS nowadays, I like to think we'd start with the patient at the centre, not the hospital at the centre, and work that way. Personal view, perhaps not college view. So in terms of integrated care and with hospitals taking over more care from GPs, in some areas of the country I've seen brilliant examples of how it's working very well and how the GPs have gladly gone into that situation because actually they see it as a better way forward of delivering care. But of course the inherent risks of losing the list, losing the registered list of patients, are that there's a huge loss of control, and so you have to ensure that you have a clear professional and responsible GP voice in that conversation to ensure that what's provided is truly what's needed for the patients and not what's needed for the system. So I could rant on this one for ages, but I'll stop there and let somebody else pick up.
Are there any GPs in the audience who work for practices that are run by hospitals? None. No hands. One hand?
Oh, one.
If you're happy, do you want to make your way to the microphone? Because we want to hear your experience. But first of all, Vish, You work for, or you run, a corporate general practice that brings general practices together. Tell me about your experience and your relationship with local hospitals.
So we've got a very good relationship with local hospitals, and part of that has come from system leadership, representative general practice coming to the table. One of the strengths of general practice for me is the entrepreneurial spirit, the ability to innovate and serve our local communities. And as we scale up, we really need to preserve that. Thinking about the question, one of the things that really strikes me is the layers that we now have to operate in general practice, with the patient in the practice and the network at scale and as part of the system. And so in the question, it was about integrated contracts. Well, these shouldn't be done unto us. We should be there co-designing them from the outset. We shouldn't allow bureaucracy to emerge from that. What we should be doing is retaining that partnership culture at practice and network level so we can respond to our communities. And ownership of quality is a risk to me. Where does quality lie when we are a fragmented group of statutory bodies and partnerships knitted together? And the last point I'd probably like to make is that every system for me needs balance. And for me, we provide advocacy, independence of voice for our patients in the system. And in any integrated contract, we need to retain this.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. What does it feel like to work for a hospital as a GP?
Well, I'm Gaj. I'm a first fire GP. I've just started working in Brecon, which is a health centre that went under about 2 years back, and it's been taken over by the Hospital Trust and been built up. So I've joined actually at a point where they've worked very hard, and it's actually a fantastic place to work for. There's a good sense of community orientation, and I think the practice and the community get on very, very well. Okay. So I love it, yeah.
Okay, and the hospital understands general practice, understands what you're there for, what you do?
I wouldn't say it's as straightforward as that, but...
It was a bit simplistic, wasn't it? I apologise.
Yeah. But with perseverance, I think, over the last 2 years, I can see the good work that's gone in and how it's transforming the practice.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. Stephen.
I think that what we've just heard is an example of why we shouldn't rule out the option of hospitals engaging in the delivery of general practice. But I absolutely think that model is one of the models that we ought to envisage for the future. But I'm clear in my own view that a model that sees general practice as part of the broader range of primary care, and too often those two concepts are thought to mean the same thing. They don't mean the same thing. Think what the phrase primary care means. General practice as primary care embedded in the range of other public services, including social care, including social housing, that meet the needs of a community, with the hospital there to deliver the acute care, but not trying to manage all the public services in a community. That seems to me to be a better model, which is why I think local government has a role to play in the development of a fuller understanding of primary and community services. In fact, just the provocation is, how can we do paediatrics without involving schools? And surely nobody thinks hospitals should run schools.
Owen, Twitter favourite.
Well, I mean, the integration of primary and secondary community and social care obviously makes sense. And at the moment, you've got that shift, obviously, of patients from secondary to primary care without the money following the patient. But when I've spoken to GPs about this, what always comes up is a lack of clarity or accountability in their development, whether the government will provide the necessary funding for them to work, and also how this fits in with securing the future of general practice at a time when numbers clearly, well, this year fell by 500 in 1 3-month period, and is falling as a proportion of the budget. But the other thing is, and some will probably roll their eyes at this being predictable, but if I'm not on the panel to say this, and what's the point of me being here, which is the risk of privatisation, which where if you have this integration where you get these large entities which are then easily or more ripe to be taken over, to be privatised. And that isn't paranoia, clearly, because we've seen a 7-fold increase in contracts to the private sector since the Health and Social Care Act of 2012. And I think that's the danger where that keeps coming up. Many campaigners and GPs have spoken about that. And we do need to talk, it's not paranoia when we're talking about Tory government policy and the risk of privatisation. Stephen says not, that they're genuinely committed to a public healthcare system. But of course, many Tory MPs and ministers are on record on a link to think tanks which are proposing exactly that, and the Health and Social Care Act, which led to so much fragmentation to the NHS. The direction of travel means we should always consider that risk of the privatisation of our NHS and where this might fit into it.
But didn't a lot of the privatisation of the NHS happen under a Labour government?
Yep.
You were predicting that question, weren't you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, yes. I mean, at the time, I campaigned against that at the time, whether it be the Private Finance Initiative, which was a bit like paying for public services on a credit card, where you get, the saddling of debt of future generations because of this wheeze where you take the spending off the public accounts, but people still have to pay for it, locked into 30-year contracts, where the value of what's been constructed is paid off in 3 to 4 years, and then pure profit is given out to the rest of them. Yes, New Labour, in so many ways, I mean, it was under your government, I have to say, Stephen, I'm not being aggressive here. They started PFI. I know it's a bit they started it. The Tories under John Major began PFI. But New Labour dramatically exploded PFI, but also other policies of marketisation. And the point about a market is there are winners and there are losers. And the National Health Service should not be founded on that basis, because there may well be winners, but the losers are patients and their lives. And that's something both New Labour and the Conservative Party are responsible for.
I feel a scrap coming on. Stephen?
I just have one simple question. I obviously disagree with what Owen said, but why? I just want to ask her a very narrow question. The PFI, I don't defend all the terms of the PFI, but I do think the basics of a public-private partnership is a good idea. And what I don't understand, genuinely don't understand, is why, if a debt is taken into the health service for future generations, that is different from a debt being taken into the Treasury for future generations and the Treasury dictating health policy. Personally, I prefer the health service borrowing the money and using the money for health, rather than the Treasury taking on the debt and the Treasury being responsible for micromanaging healthcare.
Well, I mean, comparing a health budget and the national deficit makes no sense.
They're both borrowings from the same people.
I mean, should we talk about Keynesian economics now? I don't know if we're going completely off.
Yeah, go on.
It's a GP conference.
The difference is with the NHS, as you're probably aware, doesn't have a central bank, which is clearly quite one complete difference. The reason the deficit hasn't gone down is because if you cut spending, what that means is people spend less in the economy, there are less tax revenues, and you spend more and more money in work benefits. Well, we went on to the economy. That's why the deficit, which the Conservative...
You're talking to a Keynesian. I'm not against borrowing. I'm simply asking the question why you think the Treasury is better able to manage debt raised for healthcare than the National Health Service. It's a simple question.
Because whilst you can bring down the national deficit by investing in jobs, which create demand in the economy, tax revenues, reduce the amount we spend on social security, you can't do the same thing if you lock the NHS into 30-year contracts they simply can't get out of, where we're paying debt for a generation. There is no way of reducing that debt. We're locked into it.
So would the audience like more theoretical economic discussions? Have you heard the description of an economist as someone who sees something happening in practice and argues it couldn't possibly happen in theory?
Correct.
Carey.
Thank you. I suppose the creation of mega practices has been less of an issue in general in Scotland. And we have been a lot more cautious around it, and we've been watching what happens in England with interest. I think that for me, the ability of a practice to remain autonomous and to remain nimble and flexible to the needs of its local community feel really important in terms of the service that we're able to deliver. And when we look at health and social care integration in Scotland over the last few years, which I think a lot of people would view hasn't gone as well as we would like it to have gone, a lot of that has been around the lack of systems to be able to join up and speak to each other. And some of that is about culture. A lot of it is about culture, actually. And some of that is about simply not having the infrastructure to allow that, like IT. So my concerns would be, as we begin to merge, that unless we sort those problems out first, then we will set ourselves up to fail. We've done a lot of work around interface working in Scotland over the last 4 years in terms of trying to improve communication and relationships and understanding and safety across the primary and secondary care interface between GPs and hospitals. And that has been incredibly interesting in terms of raising the same themes around knowing the culture, knowing each other's roles and remits, and needing to improve systems to make care safe and systems work.
Thank you very much. Vish, very quickly.
So, Carey, I come from a practice that has a personal list system. We really value continuity. So the key features of general practice that I believe in are those that enshrine autonomy, localism to serve your community, and distributing leadership as much as possible. So you just design that in as you scale up. You create the flotilla of small boats rather than the supertanker. And that way, you retain all the attributes of general practice that we should value.
And I can see that there will be economies of scale as practices come together, so you share backroom functions, but I think that there will always be more challenge around allowing continuity of care, and we know that that has significant impacts on both morbidity and mortality in terms of patient outcomes. So I think it's important to maintain that balance.
Brilliant. So we have a tweet. When on earth are we going to start talking about Brexit? Who knows? We'll see. Another one from Dr. Hatt. Integrated care is an opportunity to improve the experience for patients. Seeing inspirational geriatricians at Hillingdon Hospital lay out and put into action plans to improve care for the frail whilst involved in community practice has been so inspirational. Thank you very much, Dr. Hatt. Let's move to our third question. Sam Finnegan on microphone 4. Sam.
Thanks, Martin, and good morning, panel. I'm an academic GP from Birmingham. My question to you is, we know that at the minute policy is prioritising access, but GPs value continuity and, as Carey just pointed out, at least a better health outcomes. Isn't it time we had an open debate with the public about what they want, access or continuity? Because at the minute we can't have both under current resources.
Helen's giving me the eyebrow. Helen.
Oh, this is a hot topic of mine. Thank you for that question, Sam. It's absolutely bang on the money in terms of what we need to be talking about. And there is inevitably a tension between rapid access, you contact your GP and get to see somebody within so many minutes, versus continuity. Unfortunately, GPs are humans and we need to sleep. We also need to take breaks occasionally, whereas the modern drive for instant access to everything, whether that's our social media or whether that's other parts of our lives, has pervaded the whole healthcare system. But it's fascinating how it's pervaded medicine so much quicker than it has other areas. I'm not sure about anybody who's needed to see a solicitor recently, but they're not very good at 8 o'clock in the evening, nor indeed are they very good at 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. So there is something about culture and having an honest conversation with people in a resource constrained environment. And I get intensely frustrated when we're expected to provide services in ways that just mean we've got to slice the cake into smaller pieces. I mean, that's the only, if we're already short of GPs, short of nurses, short of resource, then the only way to cover the extended hours with the people is to do it more thinly. And it costs more just to keep the lights on and the buildings open. And if we don't pay ourselves more for working out of hours, which most of us don't, actually we still have to pay all the rest of our staff considerably more to be there on a Sunday afternoon to measure routine blood pressure. However, as I mentioned yesterday, I do believe that this is an area where technology can help us and can help us balance the tension. Because for me, I know full well that providing that continuity of care is so very important for my complex patients, my patients with specific needs. But there are some patients for whom continuity of care just doesn't matter. And it's really hard as a GP to say that, because I love seeing patients coming in with their trivial illnesses, because it means that when they come in for something complicated, I've established a relationship. But in the harsh reality of a resource-poor environment, something has to give. And it's probably the more straightforward stuff that somebody else can do just as well, if not better than I can, that's going to have to be given up so that we can preserve continuity for those who really need it. So again, I could wax lyrical, but that's the gist of my feeling on this. Let's have the conversation with the public. Let's let them decide, and frequently they decide very wisely, whether they need rapid access to see anybody or continuity with somebody they know. But let's have the open ways in so that we can make it easier to get people in the right place at the right time. What I hate, the worst of all worlds, is somebody who should have seen anybody on the day who waits 10 days to see me and is in a really bad way, and that really upsets me, and I suspect it upsets you too.
Thank you. Laura, access to continuity, is that a real
I think actually they're kind of, it's not one or the other. I think it's both, but maybe not all from the same person. I was a little concerned the other week. Somebody told me about a new app, which is a bit like an Uber, but you can dial up a local healthcare practitioner or a nurse or doctor to be seen, and the nearest person to you who volunteers will appear. Which I can't quite remember the name of the app. I wish I had. It's just gone. But I found
Quack
that.
Doctor?
Well, I have no idea what it is. But I understand the rationale of it. But the reality of it for people is that I think at the point where people believe it's a crisis, then they want access. At the point where it's actually about the whole of their health and their wellness and prevention, I think that's where the continuity comes in. So I think they're speaking to different types of patient. I've never, whether it's working in A&E, whether working on the community, I've never appeared at the door of somebody who I've never seen before when they feel they're in crisis and they've said, well, no, I don't want to see you, I want to actually see my usual nurse or my usual healthcare practitioner. When it's a question of wellness, they do want to see someone they're familiar with. So I think that it's really a different type of, which, linking exactly to what Helen said, means that maybe we need to think more diversely about the range of how we use those services. And I really don't think the answer is having someone with a script at the end of the phone who doesn't know anything about health.
Thank you. So one of the arguments that politicians make about access is you have to maintain good access in order to keep the tax-paying classes on board with the NHS. If you have poor access, they leave, they remove their support, the NHS collapses. Is that a legitimate argument?
Depends how many of the tax-paying classes actually use the NHS when they're at the higher end of the tax.
Stephen?
I agree with virtually everything, not quite the last comment, but virtually everything Laura said and Helen. The key answer to this question, do you want access or do you want continuity, is surely different people want a different emphasis, and indeed the same person wants a different emphasis at different stages in their lives. And therefore we have to create a system that is sufficiently flexible to be able to respond to those two different drivers. The other point I want to make is that we mustn't, I think, in the world that we're moving into, think of access to the healthcare, or indeed the healthcare system, the health and care system, as purely reactive. Because there's a lot of talk about the ability of digital technology to connect services up better, which is something we need to do. But what digital technology can also now start to allow us to do is to make informed early interventions. And the public healthcare system, not just the NHS, the whole public service system needs, I think, to be much better at investing in and using digital technology to deliver proper population health. That's part of the way of delivering proper primary health, which is a phrase that I've already referred to, which I think is important. And it isn't helped by politicians who define primary healthcare as being on-demand access to a GP. Primary healthcare is a much more important concept than that.
Carey.
Thank you. I would agree with a lot of what's been said, in that access and continuity are valued by different people at different points in their lives, depending on what's wrong with them at a particular time. But there will always be groups for whom continuity is particularly important, and those are the people with the most complex healthcare needs, and often those with mental health problems and addiction problems and difficult social circumstances as well, who don't want to retell their story to lots of healthcare professionals. And I think if we think about why continuity is important, not just to individuals from a human relationship point of view, but to the NHS as a whole, if we think about why the NHS has been able to deliver such a high quality service for 70 years on such a low amount of money overall, it's because of the cost effectiveness of general practice. General practice is based on relationships of trust, which are built through continuity and built through the context of knowing somebody within their life and within their family and within their community. So as we start to lose that, then we start to lose the ability to hold risk out in the community and to genuinely share decisions with our patients, and we start to lose the ability to deliver things like realistic medicine. So I think it's really important that we don't sacrifice continuity on the altar of access.
Owen.
Well, in a properly resourced National Health Service, this would be a false dichotomy. I know we're not there, but this again demonstrates why, when we're having to talk about how we deal with unnecessarily scarce resources and doctors, well, we're having to have these sorts of debates. I think this is tragic because the 1948 dream was of general practice was continuity, without glamorising or being roasted into about an era in which I did not live, the family doctor and so on. And the evidence base does suggest, on balance, that it provides better care and it's good for patients and for doctors. But that lack of funding, the lack of respect that GPs and general practice has been shown, and that you know, the fact that doctors are unable often to provide safely for their patients has put that under threat. Now, when I speak to GPs, what always comes across is, you know, that point about access, how frustrated they are that they can't see their patients in a timely fashion. And that pressure has led, I mean, I found this survey astonishing by the BMA. 95% of doctors are scared of making mistakes in their day-to-day work because of that pressure. But this is a false dichotomy. We should have a gold standard National Health Service which can provide good access but also continuity, which was at the very heart of the dream of 1948 general practice.
So Ashley Liston on Twitter says, continuity or access, it's surely not either or, it's about ensuring we provide continuity where it matters, and GPs need to make sure that they make those decisions with their patients. Ashley, are you in the audience?
Yeah.
Where?
Near microphone 2.
Ashley, can you go to a microphone, Ashley? Ashley, how do you have those conversations with your patients?
I think it's about trust. I think patients will accept that continuity may not be required if they hear it from their GP. Come and see one of my colleagues. Come and see a nurse practitioner, somebody who can actually deal with your problem better. Maybe a social prescriber allocated to the practice. But I think the GP needs to coordinate that. I think it's a public debate, which is the question. I think it's a personal debate with our patients, and I think we're really well placed to do that.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask Vish in 1 second. We are going to then open up to questions. So anybody who's got questions, please line up at the mic. We might not be able to ask everybody, but please be prepared to do so. Vish.
So I think I agree with that, Ashley. I'm falling towards continuity in teams. We build continuity, patients tell us, somewhere between 8 and 15 contacts. And the thing I grapple with is, you know, is it best to build that continuity before the serious illness, before the long-term condition? Or, you know, as part of the honest conversation, do we say, should that be when that happens? My fear about the access debate and the digital debate is that it kind of is predicated on a quite medicalised model. It's about feeding the beast of the demand and taking us away from that honest conversation with the public. And I think it's really important that we remember that.
Thank you very much indeed. We have a question at microphone 4. Please introduce yourself, where you're from, and your question.
Thank you. My name is Katrina Morton from Craig Miller Practice in Edinburgh. And if I could just say a few slightly tongue-in-cheek words, but there's a serious purpose in question. We spend NHS millions on our IT. That goes to a very small number of large commercial companies who give us an often poor and inflexible service, as Helen told us yesterday. In IT terms, many of us and our patients suffer far more. Yesterday, we were delighted by the rather Einsteinian Ben Goldacre, who understands how we work, is a sort of genius, and clearly puts patients first. Could the college please be very bold? Could we, with the government, work with Ben to develop a free clinical IT system for general practice for anywhere, using open source software? We could lead the world in yet another area of primary care, probably for less than the cost of a few of our Microsoft licenses.
A question that is both obvious and radical. Helen.
Yeah, it's one of those questions that has a superficial appeal but needs a bit more scrutiny. So, I mean, I just love the idea of there being one system that we all use that's totally interoperable and integrated. The risk when we have just one system and one way of doing things is, A, for a start, it won't be as good as what's out there already, so everybody will wail and lament when it comes in, but we can get over that. The challenge, actually, is that if you haven't got any competition, if you haven't got two to choose from, then the risk is that there won't be the internal imperative to keep driving up the standards and the quality. However, the good news is, absolutely, the college has already committed to working behind the scenes with government and with authorities to help move the IT agenda forward. We've got a fantastic group of phenomenally clever GPs who are passionate about moving the digital agenda forward, who are working on this stuff already, and we are testing some systems, and not just the systems in the UK. There are some other GP software systems from around the world which are phenomenally good, use much more modern platforms, and have the whole interoperability built into them, so that the fundamental thing is that anything we have from now on has to be able to talk with every other new thing. I want a red line across NHS IT, which is from this day forward, it all has to talk to each other, it all has to be coded, it all has to work. And I think just that would be a great start. I think the nirvana you paint is probably a step too far. I love it, but it's got a few inherent challenges.
Please come back.
Could I just say, I didn't say we just needed one system. I said it could be available to everybody, which is different.
Okay,
Thank
fair
you.
enough.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other panelists? Carey?
Thank you, Katrina. In Scotland, we've just established a joint IT working group between the Royal College of GPs and the SGPC, the Scottish General Practitioners Committee of the BMA, which has been a very interesting group full of three-letter acronyms that I don't understand, but I'm learning. But I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, IT is so essential to our working lives now, whether we like it or not, that when it goes down, suddenly our working life becomes intolerable and unsafe. So we need a much better IT infrastructure to be able to deliver our work. I know that there are early plans, some would say very aspirational plans in Scotland to build a joint health and social care single platform, which will be interoperable and will also allow differing levels of access for different healthcare and social care professionals needing to access or input data. And this is probably a few years down the line, but I think that we need to be visionary in how we see our IT, because it's very far behind many other organisations that rely on it, and we rely on it for safety, for patient safety, which you could argue is the most important thing.
Owen, very quickly.
Well, just very quickly, when I hear NHS IT system, I just have these flashbacks a few years ago to the failed NHS patient record system, which cost, it failed and cost £10 billion. It was described as the biggest IT failure ever seen. So I would just say, as long as it avoids that, and you get these presentations by these private IT companies, they come in, they'll transform things forever and look at what they can do.
Unicorns and sparkles.
Unicorns and sparkles, but that was a very, very big case study in the catastrophe that can happen if they're listened to without that added scrutiny.
Absolutely right. Stephen, very quickly.
I absolutely agree that with Owen that was a warning tale, but equally the warning tale that we cannot allow that to allow ourselves to draw the conclusion from that somehow this is all too dangerous and we can't do it. The key surely is to ensure that we make decisions about an IT infrastructure that allow the different parts of the healthcare system to be interoperable, to speak to each other, but also that the health service speaks to the rest of public services, critically to social care, but other aspects of public services as well. And it does have to be built in incremental steps. Nobody wants to put all their eggs in a single investment basket here, but building an information system that allows us to take advantage of everything digital science offers now is central to the delivery of the ambition of population-based universal healthcare. Without digital, we're doing it with one hand tied behind our back.
So we're going to go for a few quick-fire questions and try and get a few more in. So microphone 3.
Hello, I'm Andrew Mackay. I'm a GP in Edinburgh. Since devolution, the health systems in the different devolved nations have been separating, and in her extended advert for GP in Scotland, the Cabinet Minister yesterday said that Scotland was the best place in the British Isles to be a GP. Do the panel agree?
Well, Carey.
Of course it is. I mean, I think we have to be realistic about how it is to be a GP in Scotland, and there are challenges here as well, which we're maybe better placed to speak about as GPs working on the front line in Scotland. We have had a lot of change over the last 11 months, as people working here will be aware of, in terms of a new contract that has come in. We still need to know really how that feels and how that's going to work. But there are significant challenges around building the wider multidisciplinary team workforce that the contract is utterly dependent on to be successful. And we've heard from Laura that there are large recruitment gaps in nursing in exactly the same way as there are in general practice. So these are very real challenges. But I do feel hopeful about the future of general practice because it needs to change. It can't stay the same. So, of course, I would encourage everyone to consider coming up to Scotland to work as a GP.
Helen.
Okay, I'm chair of the whole college of Royal College of GPs, so clearly I have no strong feeling one country or another. There is now kind of college wisdom that we have diverging healthcare systems in the 4 nations of the UK. But the solutions to our problems are actually converging in terms of how we work, the sort of care we want to deliver. What I would say is kind of a few sort of little facts. I mean, we look across at Northern Ireland, who have got some of the worst funding problems in terms of primary care. And the one thing worse than having government is having no government. And they struggle with that. That is a problem, yeah. And so regularly when we have conversations in the college about the situation in Northern Ireland, the conversation goes, but you still haven't got a government to even have a conversation with about improving the situation. And I have to say the GPs out in Northern Ireland do an absolutely amazing job given what they're dealing with. That wasn't just meant to be a populist comment. So obviously, I want to get out of Scotland safely and alive, so clearly Scotland is an absolutely amazing place to live, work and play, and I would like to give a big shout out to Scotland. Actually, interestingly, in England, we've got the best ratio in terms of funding of general practice. We've had the biggest set of promises for the future for general practice in terms of the GP Forward View, their promises. And interestingly, the money stuff is being delivered, although, of course, as we all know, the workforce has gone backwards, which has kind of undermined a lot of the great stuff. So, I couldn't say truly where is the best to work. And I have visited all the 4 countries and I meet GPs in all of them. What I do know is wherever you work, GPs are absolutely amazing and doing an absolutely marvellous job, working their socks off along with their teams. And I think the solutions we seek are a lot more similar than the healthcare systems may lead us to believe. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Stephen, very quickly.
I just want to make a very brief point. I think Helen is right to say we don't really know where in the UK is the best place to be a GP. And that's one of the issues right across the health service, is that we need to be better informed about what's going on in different parts of the health service. As it was once said to me, the health service doesn't have an innovation problem, it has a second adopter problem, understanding where good practice is and generalising it. And it's one of the things through the NHS Confederation. We don't have a Scottish arm at the moment. We would very much like to have one.
So a question for the questioner. Do you think that general practice in Scotland is as good as you say it is to your English colleagues?
Yes, I love what I do and I love where I do it. But we do have a vacancy.
You do realise there's no such thing as free advertising, don't you? Microphone 1.
Thank you. I am John O'Kelly. I'm a general practitioner in Northern Ireland.
Oh,
thank you, Helen.
I didn't see you down there, John. Yes. The lights are bright.
I work in Derry, which is right on the border between the north and the south. A third of the doctors qualified outside of the United Kingdom. I have staff who live in the Republic of Ireland and work with us. I have patients who are cross-border workers. I have patients who live in the north of Ireland and work in the Republic of Ireland. We view, or I view, a potential no-deal Brexit, and I'm sorry to bring that up, Martin, as a potential disaster for us. As you're aware, I was a former chair of the college in Northern Ireland, and I dealt with 4 health ministers in 3 years. Why does politics seem to be failing us at the moment? We have the Labour Party fighting. We have the Conservative Party imploding. and we have potentially the most important decision to be made for a generation, and nobody seems to be taking control.
So why is politics failing us? And let's focus specifically on the Brexit issue. Who'd like to have it? Everyone's... I almost thought you all put your head down then. Laura, please.
I think one of the main reasons why we're being failed across the board is because what's been forgotten is the personal is political. And actually, what happens to individual people is really the key point here. I don't think I can talk about Brexit today, and certainly we're in Black History Month. We've got 70 years NHS. We're also 70 years since Empire Windrush, and the scandals that have happened to the Windrush generation in relation to their health and contributions. And I kind of think that when I see that, I think that's just a small window of what we may see post-Brexit if there is not a clear plan going ahead. The NHS system and the arrival of the Windrush generation are inextricably tied. The large majority of the people on that boat were nurses, doctors and healthcare professionals to actually staff and support the NHS, which was launched and then found to be short of people. I feel history is repeating itself. I just think that politicians need to start thinking about the impact on people, whether those people are patients or workforce. This scares me more than the idea of whether or not we have to pay within the system.
Thank you. Stephen.
In addition to chairing the NHS Confederation, and quite separate from it because the Confed doesn't have a view about this, I have a very strong personal view, which is that I chair the European movement and am wholly opposed to Brexit. As chair of...
Can I just clarify? So the NHS Confederation doesn't have a view on Brexit?
The NHS Confederation has to work with the government and is a charity and does not formally have a view about Brexit.
Like
is that
the
okay?
RCGP?
Given the implications of Brexit for the NHS?
Well, I think that what we have been doing through the Confederation is working to try to secure a Brexit that, if there is to be a Brexit, which doesn't undermine the workings of the health and care system and the associated industries. And at this moment, I think very clearly there is no prospect of the government having a deal that it can put to the House of Commons and pass through the House of Commons. And that's why, through the European movement, we've been campaigning for a people's vote, because I think it's absolutely clear that what was promised in the referendum is not going to be delivered. And the only people who have the right to commit this country to this path, if this is what's going to happen, is the people themselves. So if you agree with that, please come to London on the 20th of October and march in favour of a people's vote.
Owen.
I mean, Brexit happened in the first place because of a failure of politics. Millions, I say this as somebody who campaigned for Remain, millions of people felt abandoned and voiceless. We know a recent academic report showed that areas which had suffered deindustrialisation and then the worst effects of austerity often were more likely to vote Leave, and that tipped the balance. But also because politicians for so long have encouraged the idea that immigration is responsible for problems that they themselves are responsible for. Whether that be the failure to build housing, whether that be the failure to protect secure jobs, or whether that be the failure to invest in public services like the National Health Service. And what was one of the best arguments against the scapegoating of migrants? And it was during that referendum, we saw the most vile lies and bigotry told about migrants. The fact that without them, the National Health Service would collapse overnight, just like that. And what we're seeing now, I'm afraid, is an ideologically driven wing of the Conservative Party, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson and the rest, who, if they get their way, will throw this country potentially off an economic cliff where the peace in Northern Ireland, one of the most sacred games that this country has had for the last generation, where the men of violence put their guns down and we could start building peace in the north of Ireland, that is being put at risk. Because of this ideologically driven Brexit. But you've just spoken already, I mean, about one of the many consequences. And it scares me as a country that given this could be months away, where all of a sudden planes could be grounded, food prices could surge, essential medical supplies at risk. But don't worry, the army will be dispensing them. They didn't put that on the side of a bus, did they? We've got all those risks, and we're not even debating them. We're being told by senior government ministers that no deal will be fine, we'll get through it, when just one example, not just peace in Northern Ireland, but the entire National Health Service there and elsewhere is at risk. It's outrageous, it's disgraceful that the positioning of politicians like Boris Johnson has brought this country teetering towards an edge, and we need to hear voices like yours more, because the public need to know what the consequences of a calamitous no-deal Brexit will be. So thank you for that.
So, Helen, just very quickly, the college also needs to work with a range of different parties. Yep. We're a charity, so we don't take political positions. Yep. Are we doing enough around Brexit?
It's something I've really wrestled with, actually. So in terms of, so we're a charity, so we can't take a party political stance on anything. Exactly the same situation that the NHS Confederation. It doesn't stop us having views. It doesn't stop us caring about our patients. And our charitable object is to encourage, foster and maintain the highest possible standards of general practice and basically work with anybody to achieve that aim. So yes, we absolutely should have a view on the elements of it that relate to our patients' health, and we've signed some very strong statements, joint statements with the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. We've signed up to some very strong pieces of work from the Faculty of Public Health Medicine about all these issues. At Council, we've repeatedly had reports and discussed this, and at our last Council meeting in September, one of our faculties brought forward a motion really to state very clearly that the Midland faculty, shout out to the Midland faculty, thank you, for stating very clearly about all these various elements of Brexit and a no-deal Brexit that are a challenge for us. What we haven't done is take a position on the second referendum, and in fact there is a lot of people would like us to do so, and in fact our trustees are discussing the risk to the charity of us having that conversation. We're taking advice from lawyers as to whether we can have that debate for the reasons Stephen says. So it's a bit complex and messy. To be honest with you, I'd love us to have the debate, because I think it's important to have healthy debate, even if we can't take a position on it. I think it's important that people feel their voices are heard and they know that we care, because I don't know about you, but it really scares me personally.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm really sorry to the people at the microphones, but we've run out of time now. I just want to ask one final, so apologies. If you want to have a longer question time next year, please say to us. Because it is good fun, isn't it? I want to ask the panellists one final question. You've got to give the answer very briefly, and that question, which has been tweeted, is if you wanted to give the NHS in 2018 a theme tune, what would it be? And your answer has to be very short, unless you're willing to sing. I think we'll start with Stephen.
Ode to Joy.
Okay.
Help. It's got to be 500 miles.
500 miles, and we are so good at it. We are so good at it.
Let's stick together.
Nice one.
I'm still standing.
Now that does need singing, doesn't it, Owen? Okay, Helen.
We are the champions.
Brilliant. I'd like to thank the panel who've been tremendous. I'd like to thank the questioners who've been brilliant. I'd like to thank all of you for participating. It's been a great session. So please, thank everybody.